Good afternoon and Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar of 2019. I want to thank you all for joining us. We are kicking off our year with an exciting and much needed topic with today's speaker, Dr. Ladrina Wilson, who will be speaking to us today about uncovering the individual meaning of diversity, serving underprepared students, and sharing service with your colleagues. And now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Ladrina Wilson. Dr. Ladrina Wilson currently serves as the Dean of Students at Scott Community College, one of the Eastern Iowa community colleges. During her tenure at EICC, she has spearheaded numerous initiatives to advance the culture as well as develop professional development programs to enhance understanding of diversity and social justice. She previously served as the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer for EICC and used this position to highlight the importance of diversity and social justice training in higher education. In addition to her roles in the community college, she has spent a significant amount of time advocating for the advancement of women and young professionals. Her work in her community earned her the designation of 2014 Quad Cities Chamber of Commerce Young Professional of the Year, 2014 Iowa Admission Professional of the Year finalist, and 2015 Gathering of Women Young and Gifted Award. In addition to her full-time work in student affairs, she also hosts seminars and speaking engagements. Her current presentations speak to the experiences of minority groups, non-dominant cultures, equal pay, career ascension, leadership, and enhancing customer service through cultural awareness. Ladrina received her PhD in Educational Leadership at Iowa State University. Through qualitative research and practical experiences as a student affairs professional, she seeks to support individuals, particularly white people, in enhancing cultural competencies. In addition, she works to assist minorities in building collaborative coalitions that invite allies to the table to support minority causes. And we look forward to hearing much more about that work. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ladrina Wilson.
So thank you for choosing to join this brief presentation, and I'm excited for the dialogue that we can have following the content that I'm going to deliver. First, I'd like to provide you an overview of the expectations for today so that you're able to track where we're headed with everything. You can advance the slide, please. Today we'll be talking about the dimensions of diversity in higher ed and kind of giving some context around what diversity conversation and dialogue looks like in higher education. We're also going to spend some time talking about better understanding our underserved students, or how to best work with our underserved students. And bear with me because I'm making the shift to using the terminology more readily of underserved, because I feel like underprepared kind of puts the onus on the student, whereas we as educators should be owning in their teaching, in that teaching and learning process for them. So I want to make sure I will use that language. You'll see me using that language interchangeably because that's kind of a paradigm shift for me. But I'm going to be talking to you also about what it is to be a person of color and how it impacts our service to underserved students, and how that lens impacts how we choose to work with that student population in terms of best practices and kind of some of the sometimes stress and accountability that we have to that particular student population. And lastly, we're going to talk about ways to identify allies within your institution and challenge those allies to step forward and share in the service of serving underserved students. And then we'll open it up for some questions. Advance the slide. So just in general, I want to talk to you a little bit about what diversity means in general. Diversity often is looked at from the context of just categorical representations. Research shows that in higher education, more specifically in the professorate, academics tend to define diversity using the EEO or protected statuses that come to mind. These categories include typically race, sex, age, national origin, and those are some of the primary dimensions that are usually referenced when individuals are defining diversity. You can advance the slide. In my research, I found that as we discuss diversity in terms of students, similar categorizations come up, but we also tend to see that people begin to have a more in-depth conversation around diversity aspects. So they move a little bit beyond those protected statuses and talk a little bit more about socioeconomics, first-generation students, and the like. Your personal experiences and your background often shape how you make sense of the diversity construct. So for some people, it can be very multidimensional, but because we all have our kind of different experiences and our different vantage points, different backgrounds, it can make the common meaning very elusive. As we work with our diverse student population, the issues related to diversity become more salient for people who have more diverse backgrounds. So what we see is that this shapes how we understand how we work with marginalized populations. Your environment can also dictate how you define diversity. If you're in a predominantly white institution, or if you're in a maybe an HSI or a minority institution, you may hear conversations that are more inclusive of categories such as single parenting or veteran students, sexual orientation, and other dimensions of diversity that really are more of those secondary dimensions that play a huge part in how our students in particular identify themselves and how they experience the world. Still, there's this other more complex understanding of diversity and appreciation that looks at intersectionality, and oftentimes that's left out of the conversation. The multiplicity of identities that people have, particularly for marginalized population, creates its own unique world experience that often goes overlooked in higher education. Nevertheless, the lack of a shared definition among individuals, but certainly at the institutional level, makes it very challenging at times to talk about diversity in a common way, but it also makes it easier for institutions to say they have a commitment to diversity because they haven't clearly defined it, but that demonstrated commitment becomes a little bit more elusive because it's stated, but there's not a common definition. So how that plays out or how it's operationalized may look a little bit different among staff, faculty, and administrators. You can advance to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, intersectionality is an important aspect of diversity, but it's often overlooked or undervalued in higher education. As we work with students, particularly community college students, and they become a more diverse group and multidimensional, it's important for us as educators to not only look at student outcomes and disaggregated data within your sections if you're a faculty member, but or across the institution if you are an administrator or staff. We need to be paying attention to who's achieving and who is not. And so when we look at different data on our students and the outcomes, we need to be thinking about all these other factors that include these secondary dimensions that students bring to the classroom experience. We need to be more intentional about how we examine what's happening with students inside and outside of the classroom so that we can better foster a sense of belonging and inclusion to cater to the various identities that our students possess. Now, I mentioned inclusion, and that is what I would consider an area that practitioners in higher education spend a lot of time emphasizing, welcoming and inclusive environments as it relates to this diversity dialogue. This is common language in higher ed, and we really focus on how all students experience our institution and use this language to determine whether we have the appropriate climate as it relates to diversity. And you may have heard terminology around chilly climate or sense of belonging and things of that nature. I consider the aspect of welcoming and inclusive environments as it relates to diversity to be probably the common ground or the safe space where higher education professionals feel most confident or comfortable talking about diversity. How people experience campus life and how it's linked to how the institution embraces diversity is usually a benchmark that many higher education institutions are comfortable acknowledging and accepting. The welcoming and inclusive and sense of belonging space is important, but it's one dimension of diversity, and it also doesn't attend to the dimensions related to social justice and equality, and furthermore, equity. By emphasizing welcoming and inclusive environments, or welcoming and inclusive strategies that are employed in the classroom, we oftentimes let ourselves off the hook for equitable outcomes. So I think it's essential that as we consider kind of what this construct of diversity looks like, that we recognize where our institution is as it relates to this type of dialogue. Are we more comfortable celebrating and embracing diversity in the sense of welcoming and inclusion? Or are we having difficult conversations sometimes around equity and social justice? Diversity dialogue can be taboo. Sometimes it's avoided, or even in some institutions, it's superficial because we haven't tackled that common definition. Can you advance to the next slide, please? So what I'd like to do for the purpose of the remainder of our conversation is offer kind of a common definition. This is a working definition on how I understand diversity. So it's the wide range of differences among people, their identities, and their perspectives. I think it's important to note that differences are not deficiencies. Rather, they're unique qualities that when considered as assets, they make us collectively stronger. Now, you likely have individuals who you work with who do not see diversity as an asset. This often doesn't get talked about in this dialogue. We make the assumption that in higher ed, most people embrace the concept of diversity, rather than seeing that there are some individuals who find diversity to be very challenging, particularly in the classroom. This can be an issue when a student has different experiences that they bring to the classroom that can sometimes complicate instruction. It could be in the form of learning disability. It could be in the form of single parents who are having a hard time with attendance, and it takes on a wide variety of shapes. But there are individuals who are serving students with diverse backgrounds who quite frankly look at diversity as a barrier, somewhat challenging. So it's through our work in higher ed that it's important that we try to bring people along in this conversation, that we don't always make the assumption that everyone is on board, because we don't have total buy-in yet up to this point. This will be particularly important as I offer you strategies towards the end of our conversation about how to share the service. It'll be important that you are able to identify the people who have bought in, or maybe the people who are on the fence, to help them move along and understand the value that diversity brings to our classrooms, to our campus. And I think that it's important to realize that as a faculty member, as an administrator, or as a member of the staff, we all play a role and have a circle of influence, and that you can move people along in this diversity dialogue or bring people alongside you if it's something that you care to champion. But it's important to acknowledge that we're not all on the same page, and we do have work yet to do in this space. Advance to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you work with your underserved student population. I'm going to share some kind of best practices on how to support the underserved student population. You may be already employing some of these strategies, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, but we'll talk a little bit about what these strategies mean to our underserved students. Can you advance the slide, please? So as we look to support underserved populations in a meaningful way, what we're basically talking about here as I go through these bullets with you is culturally relevant pedagogy. So I think it's important that you understand and show appreciation for your individual students' cultures, their backgrounds, and the stories that they bring into the classroom, and recognize these as positive attributes. We don't come into our experiences with our students knowing everything about them. And so if you can find a way to get to know your students a little bit better, get to understand their culture and their background a little bit better, it yields better results in terms of student outcomes, because they feel like they have an advocate in you, someone who is willing to listen and come alongside them in their higher education journey. Another important aspect or strategy that we can use when working with our underserved student population or underprepared student population is to be a cultural informant. In the world of the academy, there are so many areas that we probably could really work to demystify. I have some responsibilities over financial aid at the institution that I serve in, and I can tell you right now, if I get an aid letter, an award letter that's issued to a student, sometimes I struggle to read through the information. Our language isn't always accessible to students, and it certainly can be elusive to even folks who work in higher education. So if we can come alongside students and help them through some of the barriers that we maybe have in place in higher education, and help them understand what are the resources available to them to troubleshoot whatever issues they're having, that's helping them become a cultural, or that's you being a cultural informant and helping the student understand higher ed better. The other thing that's maybe a more higher level concept to consider, but there are little strategies that we can employ to be a cultural informant. I know that sometimes our students can be very informal in their communication with their instructors, with their administrators, and just helping students understand this is how we communicate in higher ed. When you send an email, you start with a greeting that says, hello, Mr. such and such, and you don't use language as if you were texting your friends, you communicate in a professional tone. So confronting them when in a non-confrontational manner to enlighten them on how to have access to power in the academy is really important. And it can be done in a very tactful way. It can be modeled for students, and just letting them know you're trying to help them understand how to behave and how to perform at their best in the world of academics. Another strategy that's really important is to acknowledge victories along the way, particularly as you're working with students who are in the low SES category. A lot of times their decision making is based on short-term successes, so that they can see that these successes are building one upon another for their end game, which is hopefully graduation or completion. So finding opportunities to acknowledge the quiz, the test, or even in other courses, the fact that they're able to juggle the multiple responsibilities that they may have both at home and at school and get through a semester is worth celebrating. And so that has a meaningful impact when working with underserved populations. Many times our underserved students who are, particularly in the community college, who are disproportionately students of color, low SES and first generation students, haven't always had someone who is ready to be their champion, someone who is ready to celebrate their education with them. In many instances, they've had situations where they've been let down by our educational system. So it's really important that you can be that advocate, but also that cheerleader for your students as they have small victories along the way. Another important piece is guiding students to the services that are available on campus. And this literally sometimes means hand-holding and walking down the hall to get them to the service, but also affirming them when they have used the support services that are available on campus. Oftentimes students report a sense of shame or embarrassment by the fact that they need the services. And so if you can encourage students to utilize the services that are available on campuses and celebrate that and let them know that the smart people hang out in the Student Success Center where you get tutoring. Those tend to be the people who are the high achievers and do well at the end of the semester, to encourage them to get access to not only you as their faculty member or as their advisor, but also to the various people on campus who are there to support them. Another important piece is seeking to understand, not just to be understood. This is especially important when we're looking at the faculty who may be participating and wanting to learn more about how we can work with underserved students. But rejecting that banking model where the teacher is kind of the sage on the stage, the person who sits in front of the classroom and kind of deposits knowledge on the students. I think if we're able to acknowledge that our students who come from diverse backgrounds bring a wealth of knowledge, experience, and assets with them to the classroom and learn from those experiences, there should be some reciprocity in their education that they're receiving and that they're engaging in with you in the classroom, and as well as outside of the classroom. So there's a certain level of vulnerability that goes with seeking to understand, being able to acknowledge that while you may be a content expert, there are multiple ways that you can approach a specific topic or strategies that students may employ that maybe wouldn't be your first line of approach to problem solving, but certainly have merit in the classroom. And so being open to what their experiences are and learning from them is an important factor in serving underserved populations. And lastly, being willing to incorporate recognizing multiple intelligences and incorporating various learning styles into your content delivery. would be another important way that you could work to best serve and best yield positive outcomes for those underserved student populations. Okay, you can advance the slide, please. So I really enjoy having the opportunity to kind of go through the slides, but I think it helps to break up the monotony if I'm able to tell you a story, because I think one of the most important pieces of being an educator is bringing relevant real life experiences to the table. And so as we talk about how to serve underserved students, how to best serve them, and how to bring allies along the way and share in the service to the student population, I think it's important, particularly for those people of color, to learn strategies on how to avoid being the token or becoming tokenized. And so I want to share with you an experience that I call have lunch in the cafeteria. I can remember early on in my administrative career, I was invited by a faculty member who left me approximately 2-minute and 30-second voicemail message inviting me to have lunch in the cafeteria. And basically what she shared was a scenario where students were having a heated debate in the cafeteria, and she thought that my presence could have a huge impact on how students feel a sense of belonging on campus. And she kind of rattled off quite a few of these key terms that we hear related to diversity dialogue. But essentially what she was telling me was that because I represent a minority group, she thought it was important that other minority students see me in my role. And it gave me pause when it happened, because I realized, especially after talking with my other colleagues who are deans here at the college, they'd never been invited by the faculty members to have lunch in the cafeteria. So I use that story as an example to let you know that I realize that even well-intended people sometimes will make you the token and put certain amount of responsibility, accountability, and ultimately service to students on you that perhaps my white counterparts aren't experiencing. So what we're going to discuss in the second half of our conversation is what are some of the things that you need to be aware of and cognizant of to prevent you from becoming a token, but also how can we uplift our white counterparts or those who are from the dominant culture to have ownership in serving underprepared students who are disproportionately students of color, first generation students, and low SES students. Okay, you can advance the slide. So to give you a little data to the context of the story that I shared with you, data shows that much of the service that is related to diversity work is placed on faculty of color. Now, the National Center for Education Statistics says that about 87% of the professorate is white. So with that being said, there are very few, although the numbers have grown over the last 40 years in terms of representation of people of color in the academy and in the professorate, there are still relatively very few people of color in the academy, which means that if all of the service or much of the service related to diverse students is relocated to people of color, you can see where the imbalance begins. So that being said, it's unrealistic to think that you can take on all of the demands that students of color may have, or all of the demands that underserved populations, first generation students may have. In many instances, because of the various barriers that are in place, these end up being some of our more high need students. So that compounds the fact that there's this kind of underlying responsibility, whether it's spoken or not spoken, responsibility that for people of color, faculty of color, to advocate for and provide service to students of color. So this demand in and of itself creates stress, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the demand for service may decrease your productivity because there's an excessive demand. Also, women in the professorate are more likely to take on service demands and are more likely to demonstrate diversity advocacy. So you might find that they are tapped into more often, and the first person that comes to mind when issues related to diversity come up within an institution. So you have to be cognizant and aware of the fact that these are things that are happening across, not just at your institution, But generally in higher ed, it's not an uncommon practice for more service to fall on faculty of color and people with diverse backgrounds. You can advance to the next slide, please. So service typically is seen as less valuable in career ascension. Now, I realize that this may relate more to the tenure track if you're at a research institution that really focuses on publications and maybe getting grant funds for research that has more of an impact there. But typically, if you're looking at outcomes in your courses, feedback from your students and surveys has value. Now, that's not to say that service doesn't have value, but on the whole, in higher ed, it doesn't have as much value when you're looking at career ascension. And we know that even mentorship, whether it's a one-to-one mentorship program that's at your institution, or whether it's just kind of the natural, maybe organic mentorship that happens, and that kinship that maybe a faculty member of color shares with another student of color, or if it's a first generation faculty member who maybe have more of a strong rapport with other first generational students, there's those connections that happen organically that puts a certain level of stress on people. It's good stress because we want to be helpful, but it doesn't always equate to career advancement opportunities. And so you need to be aware of that as you're taking on these additional responsibilities. Now, it's important that you do what's in your heart to serve the students. And we know that these are valuable experiences for underserved students, that they have these one-to-one type of relationships, or that you engage with them outside the classroom. Maybe you're intentional about attending their events that they're hosting or holding on campus. But just keep in mind that this is how it's viewed externally within your, not externally, but internally within your organization. There may be value to it, and so it's something that you need to be aware of, but it typically doesn't hold the same value as the completion of certain projects or high-profile projects that are put before you. So what I want you to think about it is in the context of understanding hindrance stress versus challenge stress. So when we're talking about hindrance stress, we're talking about the maybe interpersonal conflict or lack of resources or even role conflict that comes with service. You may be asked to serve on different committees if the word diversity comes up. People may notice that you've been able to make inroads with maybe some of the more challenging students, and so you have other faculty members who are directing students to you for resources rather than them seeking out the resources to see how they can best execute or emulate some of the strategies that you're currently using. Hindrance stress is typically the type of stress that decreases productivity over time and leads to burnout. And then there's challenge stress. Challenge stress is related to maybe the workload or those new initiatives or programs, those high profile types of projects that you could be assigned to within your institution. Challenge stress is often looked at or viewed as leading to productive results, and it leads to an increased sense of value within the organization. And so you have to be careful as you balance your internal pressure of, I really want to make sure I'm available and avail myself to students who need me, who may be some of the students who have the highest level of need, and recognizing how do you want to manage that on your personal level, but then also think about what's happening at the institutional level, because sometimes there's pressure from the institution in the form of some of these hindrance stresses that the institution maybe doesn't even, or a supervisor maybe doesn't even realize that they're putting on you. In my case, I felt like, especially me coming into my new administrative role, I wanted to make the faculty happy. I also felt really comfortable eating my lunch in my office because most often I didn't even have a chance to finish my lunch. And so that was a hindrance stress where there was maybe an institutional pressure that was put on me because I want to make sure that the faculty feel like I'm available to students and see me in my newer role. But I also had the internal pressure that I was putting on myself because I realized that this faculty member who couldn't even use the word student of color that's what she was getting at in the cafeterias. There was a group of students of color who she wanted to see me, who she wanted to have see me. There was this internal stress of maybe meeting the needs of that group because clearly the faculty member didn't feel that she was equipped to be that person or be an ally to them. You can advance the slide, please. So we want to talk really briefly about disrupting the cycle and how do we empower allies? How do we create these opportunities to where the service doesn't always fall squarely on those individuals, particularly faculty of color? We need to identify those colleagues from the dominant culture who are likely allies. You probably know who some of them are. You may know individuals who are maybe asking for resources or have asked you questions about how to work with student populations. They maybe don't have all the answers, but they're at least vulnerable enough to approach you and ask you difficult questions. They're showing an eagerness to want to connect with students who maybe they don't see that same kinship that you have. And so they're trying to find ways to identify with students. Those are the colleagues that you want to identify and really pull into the fold. You need to help your colleagues understand that just by virtue of being a person of color, it doesn't give you automatic credibility and make you the diversity leader. It doesn't mean that you're going to serve students better than they are. It just means that you maybe have a kinship that you can pull from some of your personal experiences to help be an informant to the students, but certainly white allies can be informants as well. It may take a little bit of time and education on their part to better understand what some of our students, our underserved students' lived experiences. But if they are dedicated to the cause, then they need to be willing to take that challenge on. And so help your colleagues understand that there's credibility in caring, especially if it's paired with meaningful steps for them to educate themselves on how to better understand diverse underserved populations. So I think that caring is important. And I often make the joke that we work as educators, not because we care. There's not necessarily a ton of money in education. There's certainly other careers that you could pick where you could earn a higher wage, but a lot of times we fall into these careers as educators because we really care about making a difference. That's one step in the process, but allies need to be willing to educate themselves on what are some of the needs, what are some of the experiences that our students may have both on campus and off campus, and how does that play out in the classroom? If you're willing to provide invitations, personalized invitations to cultural events and programs, that could be one step in helping an ally learn more about a particular culture or a particular student population. And so when I say a personalized invitation, it makes a difference if you're trying to pull someone along in service, if you are able to kind of serve in a mentor capacity to them. So I wouldn't encourage a mass email to go out. Or I would really encourage you spending that time similar to what you may do with a high needs student to really cultivate that relationship with that ally so that they are willing to accept that personal invitation and be more versed in the background of a specific culture. I would also encourage you to share culturally relevant practices. We talked about some of those strategies that you use when you work with underserved populations, but I would also encourage you to work across your discipline, across disciplines, to invite colleagues into a dialogue about diversity. This would include asking tough questions. Are other faculty members assigning texts or readings that are representative of the student population that they serve, or is it from the dominant culture's vantage point? That's an early first step. If you can look at who are your students reading, what vantage point are they reading from? Is there gender balance in the text that they're using? Is there racial and ethnic balance in the text that they're using to educate our students? The other tough questions that you can be asking is, a lot of times we like to tote programs that were successful, but asking the question for who forces everyone to look at outcomes for all populations. And so that's been one that I've really tried to champion within my institution. A lot of times we will celebrate our successes when we've had gains in a particular category on a student outcome, whether it's completion, retention, persistence. But when I ask the question for who, we have to disaggregate the data and look more closely at, are our outcomes equitable? And do we need to be paying more attention to a certain student population? Because in order for our students to have success, it really needs to be an all hands on deck. It can't fall on the few people of color in the organization to really uplift students who need support, additional support. And also you need to be willing to ask, can we do things that are different to make sure we are serving all students and not get caught in the we've always done it this way type of approach. And it's important that you realize that when you're asking the question, can we do something differently, the we doesn't always end up, it doesn't have to be you. You have to be willing to share in that workload and excuse yourself from some of the responsibilities, maybe that internal responsibility that you feel to a certain student population. Can you advance the slide? Okay. And as we wrap up how we can, we consider how we can work with bringing allies along, I think it's important for us to really discuss accountability. In order for all students to be served, as I mentioned, we have to have all hands on deck. And that means each of us has a responsibility to equitable outcomes. And so keeping that at the forefront of the minds of all of the educators within your institution, maybe if you want to start at the department level, but keeping those equitable outcomes at the forefront of the conversation is really important. Doesn't mean that you're the only one doing the heavy lifting, but it will sometimes mean that you have to kind of continue to beat that drum. If you find an ally to work alongside you, they can also be the one to ask those difficult questions in the meetings. By being one of the few who can lead the charge, we let people from the dominant culture off the hook. So there's a certain degree of accountability that you can personally have, but we as an institute, within your institution, we all should be responsible for equity and outcomes. You have to step back and evaluate, can you be strategic in your approach and sharing in the success of all students, including students of color or LGBTQ students and other marginalized populations? So there comes a point where you have to decide, is this something that I can take on? Is there someone else who can help me along the way? I think when you personally have a high degree of kind of internal accountability, you have a more hands-on approach. You want to save every student. And the reality of it is you're only one person. You do yourself a service and you do your students a service, and you make your impact exponential when you can try to replicate yourself by bringing allies along in this type of work. I think it's really important that we recognize that you have an opportunity to be a conduit to cultural competency across your campus. It may start with one relationship with a peer or a colleague. It may start at a departmental level. And depending on where you are in the institution, it could be a more broad approach that you use. But you do have a tremendous opportunity in front of you to increase cultural competency among your colleagues so that we can increase overall student success. And with that, I will turn things back over to Lydia and see if there are any questions that I can take at this time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been really, really incredible and really right in line with, I think, a lot of what we talk about here at Catch the Next. So I would like to open it up to questions. If anyone has a question, again, you can feel free to type it into the questions pane. And you can also use the hand raise feature on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will unmute you so that you can ask Dr. Wilson a question yourself. Give people a little bit of time to think. And in the meantime, as you were talking, Dr. Wilson, I started thinking about bell hooks and teaching to transgress. And in that book, in her introduction to it, she tells a story, sort of her educational journey. And she tells the story of starting out going to segregated schools in the South and being surrounded by teachers who really cared about their students. And then eventually going to integrated schools and feeling like that she was, basically, a second class student, and having to really fight and struggle to get the attention of her teachers in the integrated schools. And then when she earns her doctorate and is preparing to go and teach, she describes starting to have a lot of anxiety about sort of being a Black woman, assuming this identity of a teacher, because she really sees herself as a writer and wants that to be her identity. And she feels like she's sort of succumbing to one of the only roles that was available for Black women in the South when she was growing up. And the way that she overcomes that is through what she calls teaching to transgress, and in sort of, through the classroom, pushing back against the norms. And I liked what you said about, being a cultural informant, because it requires us to interrogate the academy as a culture itself, right? So that we can't just talk about marginalized cultures. We also have to talk about, okay, what are the central cultures then? And so she does that, and she works a lot with that in the classroom. And then I was thinking also about a talk that I recently heard by, her name is Becky Weiling Packard, and she studies mentoring. And she was talking about, instead of maybe like formal mentoring situations, how can you embed mentoring in the classroom to expand the reach of mentorship? And so I guess what sort of bringing those two ideas together, I'm curious how you see, faculty of color, leaders, academic leaders of color, administrators, as working within classroom spaces, but then also, mentoring faculty and administrators from the dominant culture in ways in which they can also, work in and through, incorporate mentoring in and through classroom spaces as a way to interrogate, that culture, the academic culture.
Okay. So I'm going to take it in two parts and hopefully answer your question. So in the classroom, from that perspective, I think I like the notion of kind of mentorship at scale, and how can you provide those opportunities to create a meaningful relationship that has impact outside of the classroom, essentially, is how I'm framing your question. Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to rejecting that banking model. If you invite students to talk to you or tell you what their struggles are as it relates to the academy, you'll find out that there's commonality among their experience, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can find out what some of those commonalities are and then embed that into early parts of your interaction and engagement with students, you address some of what their biggest stressors are, and it also helps build that rapport that they have with you. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what I found through some of my research is a lot of times faculty members are using this as a kind of a culturally relevant practice that they have unintentionally in the classroom. So early on, some faculty members are using journaling as a way to kind of find out what's going on with students. They're embedding some information into their syllabi because it's based on their previous interactions with other students about resources that are available, maybe above and beyond what they typically would have done in the past, and that's based on their interaction with students. And so we can learn from our students what their needs are by if we create the space for them to have that dialogue. And I know that instructional time is so critical, and most faculty members cannot get enough of it. But I think there's ways to incorporate it into early parts of your engagements in the classroom, so that students are getting information and know that they're not alone in some of their concerns and some of their experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and also, go ahead.
That then creates that kind of mentorship experience, and then also it can encourage students to come alongside one another and create kind of this more of a cohort type of experience, because they realize they're not alone. They have similar struggles. They don't know all the answers, but they have someone either in you, the faculty member, or in their classmates who will stumble along that road with them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent. Thank you so much. And we have a question now from Catch the Next CEO, Dr. Maria Chavez. I'm going to unmute you, Dr. Chavez. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Oops.
Hello.
Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me now? Great. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Deandra. We really enjoy your conversation. I learned so much, and I would like to follow up with a question regarding what type of professional development could be given to other faculty to be more inclusive within the classroom. I noticed that you mentioned that you had done professional development previously, so I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, so I think as it relates to diversity, it needs to be something that's ongoing. One of the programs that I've implemented here at Eastern Iowa Community College at essentially almost no cost is we have a monthly series. With the beginning of the year, individuals are nominated to participate in what's called the Diversity Academy. So September through April, we have monthly meetings where we bring in a regional expert on a particular content area to talk to faculty members about that particular population. So topics we've covered would include students with disabilities. We have done Muslim in America, where we've taken individuals to a mosque so that they could experience that. We have done the LGBTQ community. So we take various different populations and those populations who have diverse needs, diverse experiences, and oftentimes are marginalized. And we bring those experts to the campus. And fortunately, through the relationships that I've had and that we have here at the college, a lot of times these speakers are coming in kind. They just give us their time. And it's a speaker series where we have the expert in that content area talk to the faculty. And they do that over the course of 8 months because it's not a one and done. A lot of times what you see with diversity training is it's either a one day where somebody comes in, or it's a staff development speaker who comes in and gives a 1 hour talk and then you're done. This is a continuous conversation. And so that's one aspect that we've done. And then we pair those speakers with actual diversity activity, hands-on type of experiences, whether it's civil discourse, how to have educational debate as opposed to arguments and those types of things. And so those are strategies that we use with our faculty here over the course of the year. And again, it's no cost. We have faculty, staff, and some administrators who participate in it as well. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. And I think the other thing is, you know, a lot of times, particularly for faculty, professional development can be very, depending on your institution as well, it can be very hit or miss if you're working as an adjunct in particular. And so one of the things that I say is so critically important, especially in community colleges, is our student population is changing, it's growing, and it is becoming more diverse day after day. No different than you would stay relevant in your content area, there's a certain level of personal accountability where you should be seeking out resources to stay relevant as it relates to diversity issues. And so while there might not be institutional structures that are in place, faculty should be looking for whether it's online resources, whether it's pairing with other colleagues to see what resources they may have to kind of sharpen their skills as it relates to working with various different students.
I'm wondering what criteria the deans would use to select individuals for that. And do some of those individuals reject the idea? Are some reluctant participants in your experience? I know that we have a situation where deans appoint individuals to do certain parts of our own professional development. And I'm wondering if you have encountered that as well.
So the way we framed it, yes, and yes. So the way we initially framed it, the nomination comes from the cabinet level. And so we thought if it came from senior leadership that maybe there would kind of be this feeling of, oh, I was selected, right? And so we've got some buy-in from that. But because of in our initial launch, which would have been, I think we're going on our 5th year, we had some people who thought maybe they were invited to participate in it because they were from a minority group or from a marginalized group. So the communication left some people, I literally had one person ask me, did you ask me to participate in this because I'm gay? And it's like, no, that was not the intent. And so what we do within the Diversity Academy is we regularly get feedback from the participants, and they have helped us sharpen how we approach inviting people to the conversation. Certainly people do have the opportunity to decline, but we have utilized the experiences and the testimonials of the individuals who have participated to then entice other people to participate. The nomination does come from the cabinet level. And if a person declines, typically it's been because they have other responsibilities. They maybe have taken on new projects in the institution and now's not a good time. A component beyond the speakers that I think has helped with getting the buy-in is, as part of this professional development experience, each one of the participants has 2 requirements of experiential learning, where they have to put themselves in a situation where they are the minority. So we have had male participants go to women's conferences. We have had individuals who will go to, maybe they've been to a Buddhist temple and they practice a predominantly Christian faith. And so they choose what that experience is. And by having that voice and choice in the experiential process, that's where we've made the most ground with people. They get to make the experience a little bit of their own. We don't force it on them. I've only had one person who I felt like went through it and kind of begrudgingly went through it and finished it, attended. And I think part of that was because it came from the most senior level, that they didn't decline it and they went through, the experience happened to them. We didn't make much ground, but for the most part, we have had willing participants who have had exceptional experiences through this Diversity Academy.
Thank you so much. This is really helpful.
Thank you. And I know we're running short on time, but I just wanted to ask one last question. I know we've talked a lot about faculty, and you are a dean of students. I wonder, how does some of this professional development translate to the student services side? So advising and registration and financial aid and things like that.
So I would say our advisors usually have the most contact and the most, they are most keenly aware to issues that our students are experiencing. And they are also invited to this type of professional development. But we do bring in student panels to try to help our staff in particular learn more about what the student experience is and how they can best serve the students. We also have advisors, financial aid officers who serve on our retention task force. And within our retention task force, we do have a couple faculty representatives, but that group of people regularly is tracking our disaggregated data and what our student outcomes are. And I always tell my staff that are on the student services side, they often are the bleeding hearts. So just the numbers alone make them feel like they have to jump in and do something. I empower my staff to take on new projects and create innovative ways to kind of disrupt the system on a regular basis, but we use the data to decide how we want to approach it and make sure it aligns within our strategic plan. So I would say that's kind of how I've approached diversity work. Some of my staff and financial aid in particular who went through the Diversity Academy decided to become Safe Zone trained and have offered, they're leading some of the diversity initiatives on campus.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Wilson, I want to thank you sincerely for joining us today, for donating your time and your wisdom. This has been amazing. And just to let everybody know, Dr. Wilson's contact information is here on the last screen. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You are welcome to reach out to me if you decide to, if this ruminates and you come up with other questions later, you can reach me at any of these methods. I'm certainly happy to have a talk with you. I do have to put a preface on my cell phone. If you text me, it may be 3 seconds or 3 days before I respond. I'm really bad at texting, but if you want to give me a phone call, I'm better at that. I'm happy to help where I can. I'm happy to share whatever materials you need that you think would be beneficial to your institution as well. I think this is important work, and it's certainly not proprietary, and I'm happy to help where I can.
Thank you so much. And we have a comment from one of our attendees, Ann Fletcher from Austin Community College, who says these were some very wonderful suggestions for all of us, and thank you. And we want to echo Ann's sentiments. And again, thank you quite sincerely, Dr. Wilson.
All right, you all have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much.